Season 4 of Notebook on Cities and Culture is brought to you by Daniel Murphy, Polar Inertia, a journal of nomadic and popular culture, online at polarinertia.com, and by Press Up, friendly web consultants who listen to your goals and provide solutions that make sense, online at pressupinc.com. Geoff, why does America need to land planes on boats?
Oh, what a great opening question, Colin. I mean, it's one of those great questions I'm not sure I have an answer to. Except it's a real sort of any world power now has to have an aircraft carrier. To that extent, it's quite significant that we, the English, the British, don't have one, because, of course, it's phenomenally expensive.
Did the British have one?
Oh, yeah, we had the Ark Royal, I think. I think that was the one they were using during the Falklands War, which was our last big sort of imperialist gesture, really, and it was quite a sort of proud moment in a way, in that these great planes, the Sea Harriers, the Hawker Harrier jump jet, they played a big part in the battle for the Malvinas or the Falklands, and they were launched from an aircraft carrier, and now I can't remember whether it was the Ark Royal. It probably wasn't. Maybe it was the Invincible, but anyway, one of those.
There was a day then when your people had an aircraft carrier, and I mean, I realized I'm ignorant of my own people's aircraft carriers with the details you reveal in this book. I mean, first of all, planes don't land on them, they get pulled in by a hook. There's a hook that pulls them in.
Well, they land on them, and then the hook, or rather the planes have a hook, and then the arresting wire catches the hook and prevents the plane from just speeding right off the other end. But yeah, I don't know how many aircraft carriers the U.S. Navy has, but it's quite a few, and they're extremely big.
This is Notebook on Cities and Culture. I'm Colin Marshall, coming to you from Venice, Los Angeles, California, sitting down today with Geoff Dyer, author of books all across the fiction, non-fiction spectrum about travel, about photography, jazz, World War I, the Andrei Tarkovsky film Stalker, particularly close to my heart, and a new one, by the way, on life aboard the U.S.S. George H.W. Bush. That is the subtitle to Another Great Day at Sea, his latest. But also Grey Wolf Press is putting out two books from him, putting out for the first time in America, two early novels, The Search and The Color of Memory. Now, when you get the call from Alain de Botton saying, what does he say? Where do you want to go? I want to put you on an aircraft carrier, some kind of military place for my writers in residence program. What was it? Literally a call from him?
It was a call from him, but the call didn't take quite the form that you've put it in. He got in touch and said, was there somewhere unusual I would like to be a writer in residence, with no, it wasn't narrowed down at all. And I very quickly realized it was crazy to think of anywhere that you might end up going in the normal course of your life. It had to be, just to make it worth my while, it had to be somewhere where this was the only way I could possibly have got access to it. In no time at all I thought, well, this probably means it would be good to go somewhere military, because I'd been increasingly interested by the military. And then quite soon after that, just in a sort of low-rent way, in exactly the same way that if if you write for magazines and they say, is there some, do you want to go somewhere for our travel pages? You don't say, oh yeah, I'll write about the place I went to last week when I spent a weekend in Seattle or whatever. You very quickly think of a kind of trip that you couldn't otherwise afford. So I opted for this experience, which I would never have been able to have in the course of my normal life, which was to be on an American aircraft carrier. And then, I put that forward in the way that you might say, if you asked me, who would you most like to go on a date with? And I'd say Charlotte Gainsbourg, and who, by the way, Alain de Botton is also very keen on. That's something that we, it's a fondness that we share, and then you would you wouldn't compromise your first choice like that. And then behind the scenes, there must have been a lot of administrative effort put in to get me on the carrier. And sure enough, my first choice of date came up.
Now, why did he choose, or why did he want you specifically to write about an institution like this? How did he know you would be the one to write about, or to know of an interesting place to go to?
Well, I'm not sure whether he had any sense of any of the writers' abilities to write about a particular place, but I think he approached the writers that he liked. And at the risk of sounding immodest, it wasn't a bad idea on his place to get in touch with me, because to me it seems that one of the things that unites my really quite diverse, wide-ranging body of work, I think place is pretty central to it, actually. I would say place is the single most important thing.
It is a nexus of interests. Everything connects at place.
Yeah, very well. I like that. Yeah, when you edit this, perhaps you can do it in such a way that I use the word nexus.
It's possible. I can change the pitch a bit on who said what. But tell me, you say in the book, you wanted to go on an aircraft carrier. England does not have one at the moment. And had England had one, it wouldn't have been a good idea anyway, because you'd have been surrounded by English accents, English people. Why have English people so worn you down?
The experience of being English, it seems to me, it's not that they have worn me down. To be English is, in a sense, to be worn down.
Yes. That's well put.
Yes, and one can put this historically, really, because, of course, by the time I was born, and I'm so conscious that there is a born-worn rhyme going on here, England was pretty well worn out. It was worn out by the Second World War. It was economically devastated by that, partly because we had to pay you lot back for the Marshall Plan or whatever it was, and then a condition of winning, of being on the winning side of the Second World War, is that that the empire was coming to an end, which was, of course, a very good thing. So that sense of post-imperial decline is so imminent to the idea, it seems to me, of being English. It's less of a problem for the Scots and the Welsh, because they can always claim they've been colonised by the English, as opposed to being part of the colonising power that is Britain. So yeah, there's I was born into a declining country, and then, of course, there's the daily kind of disappointments of England, really. I guess what happens is that all the economic things manifest themselves in a particular psychological way. So, although we've had some brief periods of some brief sort of renaissances, such as winning the World Cup in 1966, it's really been, as my friend Sukhdev Sandhu put it so brilliantly when he went back to England recently, he said to him it seemed like the whole country was in the grips of a nationwide downer. Nationwide downer. And, with the recent recession, it was bad here as well in America, but there was something about it where it felt like it was here it was at odds with the basic American optimistic spirit. Whereas I felt in England we kind of welcomed it psychologically in a way, because this seemed the true expression of the state of things, a depression. So I'm very conscious that I'm working towards that Raymond Williams phrase, the idea of of a structure of feeling.
It brings us to the England one will read about, an American can now read about, in The Color of Memory, your first novel reissued, that draws from your life in the 1980s in London and Brixton, on the dole, doing what you could. The London of this book, there's a passage in the book where the protagonist, talks about walking over a bridge, looking at the river, and seeing the river as oily, dark, and full of harm, which describes the London of The Colour of Memory fairly well, or at least through this character's eyes. It is oily, dark, and full of harm. There's random beatings, everything's broken, vomiting on the tube. The character nails metal all over his doors because of the likelihood of being the door just kicked down by thugs. What was wrong with London at that time?
Well, yeah, this is the London of the mid-'80s, and I can sort of contextualise that quite easily. It was the heyday of Thatcherism, when it was this sort of it was this kind of freebooting, devil take the hindmost capitalism when everything was being privatised, and in a way, all of the kind of culture of that time was about these kind of yuppies, and it's quite a while since I've even used the word yuppies, or these bankers making lots of money, all this kind of stuff, and that was in a way a dominant culture. But I think what was interesting about this time is that the older England, whereby, of the welfare state, all those kind of safety nets were still in place. And so for somebody like me, somebody of my age, I'd left university, which had been free, and of course there were no jobs to be had, but it was possible to lead a life quite nicely on the dole if you settled for a sort of low income. And so in a weird way, amidst all the brokenness that you've described, it was possible to lead a really quite idyllic life, which is now no longer available, now that London is not nearly as broken. But, I mean, that's a different, I think the brokenness, we could talk about that. But, it was possible to live in this really, quite an idyllic way, I think. But, it was, it really was in Brixton in particular. It was a very exciting time to be there, but it was very rough. There was a constant possibility of getting both mugged on the street and robbed in your home.
He puts money in his shoe as well because, I'll probably get mugged.
Yeah. I mean, and all of that was absolutely true. And, I remember one time I shared my flat with my flatmate. He was in one bedroom. My girlfriend and I were in the other bedroom. And then, she opened she noticed our bedroom door open, and somebody had broken into the flat while three of us were there sleeping in it. And then she rather courageously leapt out of the bed, and the guy dashed out of the...
Oh, it's there still.
Oh, yeah. So, it's what... I don't think the phrase existed back then, but it was a kind of home invasion. And that was all... that was just the sort of reality of how things were. And I think in a way, back then though, we used to go to this fantastic pub called the Atlantic, where, for example, Courtney Pine would be playing, and Steve Williamson. It was the sort of jazz renaissance going on. And it was incredibly violent, that pub. I mean, you would be really reluctant to go for a pee in the toilets because of the certainty of getting mugged there. But I think when you're young, that kind of thing is quite exciting. So, you can't read anything about New York these days without getting somebody probably a bit older than me, without getting sort of, Lenny Kaye or somebody like that reminiscing about how great New York, the Lower East Side of New York was, when it was bankrupt and cheap and really quite dangerous.
Contrast for me then the deep pessimism and crumbling infrastructure of the Colour of Memory London with the attitudes and built environment of the U.S.S. George H.W. Bush.
Well, in a way, I don't think I need to particularize it quite as precisely as that, because, in a way, the aircraft carrier is a little sort of, it's America itself on a small scale, and like many people, like many visitors from England, when I first came here to America, I loved the sort of psychic change. I loved that, American can-do attitude, that kind of, the answer's yes. Now, what's the question?
Right.
Which was so... I hadn't realised up until that point the extent to which the English equivalent The answer's no. Now, don't even tell me the question. I hadn't even realised that how negative the culture that I'd grown up in was. And the difference is essentially between, England and America like that. And one can see how these things are never just the expression of, or rather, all these sort of psychological or attitudinal things, they're always shaped by an economic thing. And, as we were saying earlier, Britain's been, coping with the fact that it's in these are manifestations of its decline, I think. And it says, it's manifested in so many ways, and in some ways, for example, there's a positive attitude aspect to it. So I think everybody rejoiced in a way when that cussed old landowner up there in, I think it was Scotland, where Donald Trump, wanted to build a golf course, and there was one bloke living on a sort of really shitty, he had his shitty bit of land, but he refused to sell to Trump and just stood in his way, and, that's kind of great. I mean, there was nothing admirable about this person, but that cussedness in the face of, Trumpism is good. And then let's put a more positive thing on this. When I think of, role models or great British heroes, well, of course, people always say Winston Churchill, a rather dubious choice in many ways. But, the people that make me proud to be British are people like the MacLibel too. Those two anarchists, I think they might have been Welsh, who were involved in distributing that pamphlet outlining all of the sort of malpractices at McDonald's, and then they got taken to court and then devoted something like the next God knows how many years of their lives, I think he was a postman and I don't know what she was doing, to taking on this, this great, awful, corporate giant. And so I like that kind of stubbornness of that's an aspect that is another side, I guess, of that negative mindset of Britain. But to come here, of course, is a great liberation, and there's a great sense of a weight being lifted from one's shoulders.
There is, of course, the other side to all that American optimism you saw, you felt on the aircraft carrier. Because I kept saying to myself, reading you go to these crew members, talk to everyone, get their stories, someone's going to mention Jesus, someone's going to mention Jesus, someone's going to mention Jesus. How long in the actual experience was it before you started hearing about Jesus?
Oh, it was funny. When I went to the church service, first of all, the guy, I can't remember what his exact name was, the guy who sort of ran the area of worship, he was really at pains to express that it was it wasn't a sectarian place. It wasn't, it was for people of any religious persuasion. And I thought that's good, and all this kind of stuff. And I guess I should say at the outset that there's this quite common misapprehension of America in Britain, that there's this kind of it's just full of born again lunatics, whereas
all with guns.
Yeah, that's the sort of the kind of stereotype. But unless I'm mistaken, there is still this separation of church and state. So I think you're not allowed to have representations of Christianity in public school classrooms here, if I understand it correctly. So that's all good.
They creep in and get challenged, creep in and get challenged.
Yeah, and of course that's fantastic. Particularly fantastic now when we see what's happened in India with the with the rise of this sort of Hindu nationalism. But anyway, then it became evident quite quickly that although there might have been the odd person of some different faith, when they were talking about the great range of religious beliefs, it was more like the fantastic array of different beers that you get in a supermarket. These were all just the different versions of Christianity, Pentecostal, Baptist, and all this kind of stuff. So yeah, it really was pretty fundamentalist Christian in a way that I'd never encountered before. But do you know, I was struck by the way I didn't really find it that objectionable, and I also didn't. I mean, I was struck by the way I didn't have my usual disdainful reaction when I hear that people are religious, whereby I think, well, you know, my normal would be sort of, how stupid can you get? But I didn't feel that.
Because that was the environment. You were on this aircraft carrier in the middle of nowhere and just ocean, where really all you had was a lot of people, and a lot of them, all they had was Jesus in their hearts, you know?
Well, they've got a lot more in their hearts, you know, they've got a great sense of...
In reality they do, but then they would say, well, I owe it all to Christ. Some of them, not all of them.
Yeah, I mean, but, you know, it's more that Christian thing reinforced a particular belief in what America was, a misguided belief, actually, in some instances of what America was. And it underwrote their, you know, great commitment to the mission and all this kind of stuff. So it was, although, you know, the faith itself was quite straightforward. There was it was part of a more of a complex of other things as well.
It brings to mind all these articles you read about the two Americas, or the forgotten America, or the coastal America and the inner America, and it seems overblown to me until I realized I don't think I knew this America you were in any better than you knew this America you were in before you went. And I mean, we sit here in Los Angeles, and furthermore Venice. You know, do you have the sense as an outsider who now lives in America of there being a real mutual incomprehension?
Well, I guess one of the first things I learned about America is that, you know, you can say America is X or Y, insert the word of your choice there, and it sounds true. And, of course, you can then repeat the exercise, inserting the exactly the opposite word, and it's equally true. And I guess, you know, it's not for nothing that the great sort of founding poet of America, Walt Whitman, talks about the ability to embrace contradictions like that. But it seems to me there are certain consistencies within these very different ideas of what America is, and one of those is a sort of deep kind of faith in the American way. Now, you might be on the one hand completely sort of you know, straight down the line, politically conservative, religious Christian opposed to gay marriage, let's say, and your commitment to the American way is absolute. But then you can flip that around so easily and find that the most liberal kind of, you know, gay married couples have a similar belief in the idea of America, which, you know, throughout its history, you know, you just go back to the civil rights movement, and there it was always couched in an appeal of how far short the existing reality had fallen compared with the ideal that America was meant to be. So it's you know, it represents a standard to be constantly aspired to.
I'm reminded of a line by a mutual friend of ours, Pico Iyer. He said, you know, if Americans don't travel, they're like a man living in a hovel, assuming everybody else lives in a worse hovel. Does that ring a bell with you?
Yeah, it's a tricky thing, this, isn't it? Because, you know, for example, this sort of American idea of, you know, everyone can rise up through hard work and all this kind of stuff, which brings with it the idea that you can leave your hovel behind. But of course, as we, you know, it's what I'm struck by is that because going to college, which is one of the sort of, you know, classic ways of sort of getting on, because that's so expensive. Now it seems to me, in some ways, people are much more sort of condemned to remain in the world they were born into than you know, than than has been the case in Britain, where, when university education was heavily funded by the state, there was quite a lot of social mobility.
About that as your own experience of moving on up from a working class background to, I don't even know is there some writerly class in England? I don't know what class one even fits into when they do the job you do.
Yeah, it's it's one of the things that I'm conscious of, actually more and more as I get older, being a beneficiary of that particular, part of the post-war settlement.
Now tell me, how many Geoff in Venice jokes have you heard since moving here to Venice?
If you've got another one up your sleeve, Colin, I'm more than ready to hear it. But
I just wondered.
It was one of the reasons that I put on the in the author information on the jacket of the new book. He currently lives in Venice, California, because I like, my willingness to hear versions of that joke is by no means exhausting.
Now, why do you live in Los Angeles?
Oh, yeah, I'm here because of my wife's work. To cut a long story short, she had the chance of working here, and at first her offices were in Santa Monica. Now they're in Culver City, and I've always longed to live in California. It's been one of the main ambitions of my life, but I'd always dreamed of living in Northern California because, to be honest, I'd never really liked LA. Like many English people, I'd just never been able to get to grips with it.
And yet there's so many here.
Yeah, but, when you say there's so many here, there are so many here, I mean right here in Venice. And I think it's because, we just can't, the rest of it it's so unfathomable to us, whereas this is, this is sort of this is like some perfect version of what we want from a city. But I feel that in a way, when my wife and I feel we don't even live in LA. We just live in this little beach place called Venice, because for me LA is a kind of nightmare actually of this it's in London. We take great pride in not owning a car. And it seems
I do the same thing in Los Angeles to a great many friends' annoyance.
Yeah, and that's admirable, and of course it's improving here. But yeah, it's if I was asked to sum up my idea of what I thought a completely wasted life would be, it would be a life spent sitting in traffic, and I just can't bear it. So there's all sorts of stuff, we miss out on the cultural life of LA as a whole because I just can't face the driving, which I find incredibly stressful and terrifying. And, it's this, I'm not saying anything new here, but, this place is an ecological disaster.
It brings to mind your countryman, Rainer Banham, who came in the 70s and wrote Los Angeles, The Architecture of Four Ecologies. He became, ironically, one of the most noted celebrators of Los Angeles in that period, which to me seems like a much worse time in Los Angeles than today. But he said something that reminded me of what you said before, that mental exercise about America, where you make a statement, make its opposite, see that it's probably true. He said, it's difficult to say anything untrue about Los Angeles. Now, is the same phenomenon going on in America and Los Angeles, where it's hard to get to grips with in that way, and that's something you can enjoy, but it's not easy to enjoy? I don't know where I'm going with that, but does it have any resonance with you in your experience here? Is Los Angeles a microcosm of that thing about America?
I don't know LA enough to say. I mean, I'm so sort of trapped within my own experience here, but I mean, what I could say is that, for example, one of the things I miss, the thing that everybody loves about New York, that constant wisecracking and interacting with people on the street, and the way you've got to keep your wits about you at all time because everybody you encounter is so sort of, so clever and up for wisecracking and bantering, that kind of stuff. That really isn't an aspect of life here. But the contrast I would have with life here is the 3 blissful months, 4 months I spent in Iowa City. Very, very small.
Rarely said, blissful months in Iowa City. There we have it.
I did the right semester, I did the fall semester, and it was only cold towards the end. But it was very, very different to here. So it's incredibly small, and also it's there's a real sense of just sort of belonging there, really. And I think it's not at all unusual because of the nature of the architecture and the sprawl of it to really not feel a great sense of belonging in Los Angeles. Maybe you would feel a great sense of longing to your particular neighborhood.
You hear a lot of that. I don't live in Los Angeles. I live in Santa Monica, Pasadena, West Hollywood. Those are all separate municipalities, but they're considered to be in Los Angeles. Or I don't live in Los Angeles. I'm downtown. Now that's more popular to say. There has been historically a lot of that. I don't live in the greater entity. I live in the smaller one.
It was something that I was so conscious of in Iowa, that it was this little place where it answered all of my needs, actually, that I had. They were all catered for, and they're quite simple. You know, I wanted a place where I could get a great cappuccino, and there were two places with great coffees. There were two of the greatest bars on earth, the Foxhead and George's, a couple of great restaurants, and crucially, a consistently high quality of conversation. Because I remember this when one of my grad students picked me up at Chicago Airport, and he was telling me about what life was going to be like, and he said, if you don't mind hanging out with your students. And I remember thinking, that's exactly what I don't want to do, Buster. It's like, drop me off at home and then I'll see you in class and that'll be it. Anyway, that particular guy became probably my closest friend in Iowa City. And then actually within about 3 weeks of getting there, I was spending all of my time hanging out with these grad students because they were so fantastic, clever, all this kind of stuff. And there were these wonderful nights in George's or the Foxhead where I realized that everybody I knew and liked was in the bar. So there'd be these nights where there'd just be like a perfect party. I would say in a way, LA is the obvious opposite of that, because it's so, because of this, the far-flung nature of it.
Now, having read about your cappuccino hunts elsewhere, I did want to ask, yes, you did that in Iowa City, but in Venice, how has the cappuccino drinking been for you?
Well, it's been, of course, great in intelligentsia, where they've raised the art of coffee making to this incredible sort of seriousness. But in a way, these are not great coffee times for me, because I've had to really cut down on the pastry. Yes, the pastry intake, and because when I was living in Williamsburg, the local cafe started stocking donut plant donuts. I think it was the only cafe maybe in Brooklyn where they stocked donut plant donuts. So I really, I was really getting through a lot of donuts. And then, once I had this stroke, I really had to, I felt at one point I'd eaten my last donut, but actually I was back in New York recently, and a guy obviously hadn't heard about this thing. He turned up to interview me with 3 donuts from the donut plant. It was like, I don't know, it was like a version of sort of Philip Seymour Hoffman falling off the wagon, and I thought, God, yeah, I could be back on a three bag a day donut habit.
Now, this guy hadn't read the article in the London Review of Books that you wrote about this stroke. I mean, how quickly after the stroke were you writing an article about it?
Very quickly I saw that there was an opportunity for generating revenue.
While still in the hospital, or soon after being released, or how quickly?
Although I put it rather sort of jokingly like that, I mean, I was obviously conscious at quite an early stage of something quite profound happening to me. And, anything that happens to you like that, of course, it's the chances are you're going to write about it, especially if it's one of these things where, it was a personal thing that happened. It was something that happened to me, but, it had such obvious general sort of ramifications. So once again, I felt I could just be, to use this English expression, I could just be the canary in the coal mine, and this particular experience would, illuminate some more general truth.
It also seems to encapsulate this fear people from other countries, but especially England, I hear this from them. They're going to come to Los Angeles, come to Southern California, and they talk about being sort of incapacitated by the place, but not literally by a stroke. They think that they think something about Southern California will weaken them. In this case, you had a physical condition that could have weakened you much more than it did, certainly.
Yeah, except, I mean, I would disagree with you slightly. I thought I was going to come to California and really begin, you know, the kind of fittest and healthiest phase of my life. So it somewhat sucked to find that within something like 8 days of getting here, I'd had a frigging stroke.
Yes,
you know.
Somewhat sucked to put it mildly. But thinking about Venice, the strokes aside from your experience here, tell me if there's any resonance between. I guess there wouldn't be, but Venice, in previous eras, less expensive eras, more decrepit eras, Venice was sort of the Brixton of its day. You know, the Brixton in the color of memory in the 80s, where it was tumble down. I mean, the houses with the canals were just shacks with muddy ditches of water, and nothing cost anything in Venice, I guess, in the 70s and even the 80s. It seems like it could have had the same environment of neglect and freedom. It's something we touched on before, but I mean, was that in the sort of color of memory time? Was the neglect tied up with the freedom in a sort of inextricable way?
Yeah, I think that's true, and it's one of the things that I'm conscious of in that book, The Colour of Memory. They go to quite a lot of these parties, sort of warehouse parties, or parties in abandoned industrial places. I should say that The Colour of Memory, it's published in 1989, and it's a kind of pre-rave era that it describes. So it's before the kind of nobody in that book. They don't go to any of these sort of what was called acid house parties where people take ecstasy, that kind of thing. But even before then, there were a load of parties not with that particular kind of music or that drug in abandoned spaces. Now, one of the things that's really noticeable in London is that it's become filled in totally. Everything has been turned, every available space has been turned into a start-up or some sort of form of branded leisure, this kind of stuff. Very different in a place like Berlin, where there's plenty of room still. And I think it's a sign, it's not good when a city gets filled in like that, when the real estate thing has reached sort of saturation point. And I think you're probably right about the analogy with Venice. And now, of course, everywhere is being bought up. And what I'm struck by is something not at all. Again, this is not something at all original, but there was a place that I was quite sort of, I really liked the look of it. It was a house, a sort of lot was being built. And I was cycling past one day and I saw the guys there and I asked if I could have a look at it because it just seemed a potentially nice place. And indeed it was. But what they'd done is they'd taken this lot and then they just built the house right up to the limits of the lot. So this little place next door, it was within touching distance, and it was totally, the only possible word, it was totally blighted by this new development. So these people who'd been living there in this little bungalow next door for however long, they would then have this whopping great place sort of overlooking them, really casting their lives into shadow, and that was just awful, really. So I think and then I've read articles about the way that some planning restrictions were loosened and all this kind of stuff. And I think on the one hand, one of the great things about LA is the famous architectural diversity, whereas, the whole sort of heritage Britain kind of thing has led to a kind of stifling of vernacular innovation. But, it's really awful if everyone is just building these kind of if everywhere they're building these places which are completely destroying any kind of the social fabric of the area.
Last time we talked a few years back was for the release of the American essay collection, otherwise known as The Human Condition. And I think to start that off, I opened up to the photo of you in the book on the rooftop there in Brixton. And I was just in London. And like any of your readers would have done, I took a double-decker bus, front row, top deck, down to Brixton to see if there was any of Geoff Dyer's Brixton left. I wouldn't know, of course, to see it, but I guess I can pull up, this requires me to open up my phone, I can pull up a picture of my own, of me in Brixton. Yes, that looks familiar to you?
Oh, how touching, Colin, that you went on a pilgrimage to just as just as I might have gone on a pilgrimage to the place where the Buddha was born, you went on this pilgrimage to Effra Road. And I think the thing about one of the things I'm conscious of in my life is that I've had this incredible ability to live in the right place at the wrong time. It's just amazing, really. So, in London most recently, I've been living in Ladbroke Grove, which is without question going through the most boring period of its entire existence. Then, before then, we lived in Camden, where I'd aspired to live all the time when I'd lived in Brixton, and that was going through probably the worst period in its history. And when I lived in Brixton, it was really rough and all this kind of stuff. And now Brixton has become this incredible sort of hub, and it's not a hub. That makes it sound like Atlanta, an airport hub like Atlanta City, but a real just great sort of place with loads of restaurants. In contrast to this affluent area of London where I live, where there's actually no good, reasonably priced restaurants. So yeah, it's I can't bear to go down to Brixton, partly because just because it was a phase of my life that's sort of over with. But yeah, everyone is telling me about how fantastic it is now, and so
I never had to put money in my shoe. I never felt like that was going to be a concern.
And it's, of course, underlying all of this is just a basic thing. I wish I'd got my foot on the real estate ladder down there earlier.
It all comes back to real estate concerns. Effra Road, it's a big part of that essay on finding the right cappuccino and croissant wherever you go. I mean, you talk a lot about, in that essay, about how you just wear a place thin with use. You probably still have Effra Road completely memorized right now, every detail of Effra Road at the time. And I went down that road thinking, what if I knew this road that intimately? What would it be like? But I feel like I didn't see a lot on Effra Road these days.
No, that's one of the things that the rare occasions when I do go down to Brixton, it looks architecturally still pretty much unchanged. So the main road outside the tube station, is still pretty sort of pretty gritty, and Effra Road is it's just this sort of thoroughfare. But I think it's in that area of the covered market where there's all these restaurants and stuff. But yeah, I mean, it's not what can one say architecturally that nobody would say that Effra Road is an area that needs to be preserved because of its outstanding architectural beauty. It went through lots of changes when I was there. What had been an empty sort of factory space then became a tiny sort of retail park, which was great for the one occasion when I needed to buy a fridge. It was incredibly handy. But yeah, so no, I think it's one of these things. I think it's not uncommon. You go to visit these famous neighbourhoods. I remember when my wife and I first went down to sort of to look at Williamsburg, and we went there and we couldn't sort of find the great hip Williamsburg because we just couldn't. And I think that could easily happen for a pilgrim trying to find Geoff Dyer's Brixton. But of course, in years to come, I'm very, very optimistic that there will be a blue plaque on Crownstone Court saying that I languished there for several years.
Now, you got a chance to revise your novel of Brixton, The Colour of Memory. You got to take things out, and you have a bit in the introduction about that, what you did, how you streamlined the book a bit. But how would the book be different if you were writing a novel now, looking back, trying to capture that era of Brixton?
Right, what a fantastic question. Yeah, it would be, I mean, it would be obviously elegiac, but then when I was rereading it, and in fact perhaps even when I was writing it, there was quite a strong elegiac note. And I don't think an elegiac thing is the same thing as a nostalgic thing. I'm saying that off the top of my head, and I don't think I've got the brain power now to elaborate on that distinction. But just as a hunch, I think it's a sustainable distinction. I think the other thing is that, you see, back then it was so much this sort of heyday of sort of radical feminists, and I can so remember how much just we all, men and women, we just hated we hated Martin Amis because he was considered so right-wing, and he was so sexist because, there was these women and he'd talk about them wearing underwear and this kind of stuff. And I can so clearly remember there was this advertisement on the tube. It was for some sort of women's, lingerie, and it was something like, underneath they're all lovable. And this drove us, me and my women friends, nuts. It was so outrageous. It showed a sort of woman slinking around, And anyway, so I think one of the things there, it's so coy about sex, that book. And there's a gain in that, there's this love interest, there's these, of course, people are sort of falling in love with each other and are forming crushes. And there's the sort of climactic sexual moment in that book is just this kiss that takes place on the rooftops. And it's very much in the style of those old films, their lips meet and then the screen fades to black. And as a result of that, I think that kiss has great sort of romantic residue. But I remember I was so sort of worried that you couldn't sort of, God, you really couldn't describe, you couldn't look at a woman's legs because that would be to be objectifying her.
So you didn't, to clarify, I feel like if I were thinking those thoughts now, I would be forcing myself to think them and say these things so that I might impress a woman. You were actually feeling this way.
Oh my God, I was so totally the. Some version of the Susan Brown Miller thing, or it really did absolutely. It was because of it really did form my consciousness, and now I think what would have to happen. I'd certainly make the sort of I think that there was an inconsistency really between the way that everything else was so explicitly described. And then, by the way, it so quickly went hazy as soon as anything sort of vaguely sexual went on. And, that kind of coyness, I think it's one of the reasons why why the later novels, Paris Trance and Jeff in Venice, Death in Varanasi, were sexually so explicit, partly to get away from that coyness. But, it really wasn't just trying to be ideologically right on, but that was
ideologically sound.
Yeah, that was a word that came up so much. But it was just how I was. But now that seems, my male, actually not just we all look back now on some sort of amazement that we got so into that kind of really. Some of it was sensible, but other aspects of it were just sort of absurd.
You talk about this in the terms somebody would talk about bell bottoms in the 1970s. I can't believe we let our pants get that big. I mean, it seems like exactly the same thing, right?
Yes, indeed. So it was, in a way, it was just a sort of phase of ideological fashion. But that really was the full white heat of radical feminism.
In the intro to The Color of Memory, you write about how, when you were the age of the protagonist in this book, you had imposed upon yourself a sort of discipline that, to the outside eye, was indistinguishable from shiftlessness, but you had actually imposed a structure upon yourself. In the new book, In Another Great Day at Sea, you're on this boat with hundreds and hundreds of 20-somethings who have this system imposed upon them, this rigorous discipline where they know when they're getting up, they know what they're doing, they know when they're exercising, they know what crappy food they're eating and when. No matter what, do we simply need to subject ourselves to systems?
Well, there's a world of difference between having a system imposed on you and generating your own one.
They did volunteer for that system, technically. I mean, of course, there's complications. Maybe they were too poor not to, but...
Yes, indeed. And that's the last act of free will, really. You sign up for the military and you exercise your freedom at that point, and after that, you sign on the line, and from that moment on, it's, you're not your own boss. But I think for me, you see, I went to Oxford, where there was this... Of course, on the timetable of the week, there were lectures you could go to. But it was nobody went to lectures, so your only commitment was to go to this one tutorial a week with your tutor, who made it so obvious that he had better things to be doing. So the whole of one's education was kind of self-determined, really. So that thing of organising your time quickly became second nature. And by the time I was living on the dole in Brixton, the idea that I would just the idea that one might just sit around watching TV or something was, one was not going to do that. And in a weird way, I sort of feel I've continued being a student, I've continued being in some sort of this sort of program of self-funded education for the sort of rest of my days.
You hear that from students sometimes. Somebody who's been in grad school 15 years they'll say, I don't know what to do but be a student. And some of these Navy guys said, I don't know what I would do if I wasn't in the Navy. People sort of lock into their tracks, and at some point you go down far enough, it gets hard to imagine being on any other track. And when does that happen?
Well, in the case of many of these guys in the Navy, it would happen. It could easily happen at more or less the same time that an athlete's career would typically come to an end. A lot of these people join up when they're 17 or 18. They put in a good long shift, and then they're out of it, often on a sort of, I don't want to get this wrong, but I think on a full pension or whatever it is you get.
Put in their 20 or whatever.
By the time they're 35, and then they're, they're ready then to move on to some sort of civilian job, and if. It's and of course many of them had been incredibly good at their jobs in the Navy. I don't know what I imagine studies have been done to show how well that particular skill in the Navy, say, in the military, can translate into being good in a civilian in a civilian environment. It might be the case that employers look very, very favourably on somebody who's had a military background.
It is possible. It shows you can follow orders. If nothing else, that's for absolutely sure. But on this aircraft carrier, how much of a structure did you have in your mind, or I'm sure Alain de Botton didn't give you one, but what was your mandate here on this boat? Just to notice as much as possible and figure it out as you went what this book was going to be?
Yeah, there was no mandate at all. What I should say is that, the idea is that at that point, 6 writers were going to go to different places, and we were all going to write books of 35,000 words. And beyond that, it was carte blanche. So it was just up. The particular nature of a given book would be down to this sort of wedding between the place and the writer. And then, for various reasons, the series itself fell into. There were difficulties, and I think at first only 3 of the 6 books got written. And for me, initially, it was the most boring book that I'd ever had to write, because I'd had the experience, I'd been on the carrier, I knew what I made of the experience, which was great. So the writing of it just involved a transcription of the experience, quite apart from that kind of transcription that many people do, where you have to transcribe interviews. But that, I'm not thinking of that. I'm more thinking of just, it happened and then I had to write it up. Right. And then 2 things happened. One is I found out just to give myself a kind of safety net, I thought it was a good idea to write quite a bit. So I wrote about 70,000 words. So the book was twice as long as it needed to be. And then I found, not surprisingly, that I'd become rather attached to those 70,000 words. And then, having that number of words, I saw that actually it had become much more of a book, much more of a Geoff Dyer book than it sort of had to be.
How did you know when it became a Geoff Dyer book?
Oh, when I started having fun with the writing of it, which came rather late in the day. And it got sort of...
beach belly business.
Exactly that, yeah. There's the bit where it goes into the third person. And then, then I started chuckling to myself when I was writing, and that was all good fun. And, and then when it turned out it was going to be, because of the difficulties with the publication aspect of the series, it was possible to publish it independently here as though it was just a sort of book by me, as opposed to just part of a series. Well, I felt, yeah, it is a book by me, although the one thing it doesn't have, which I say with not with any great arrogance, but I think it's true. All the other books have been structurally quite interesting and innovative. Structurally, this is very, very straightforward. It begins on with me flying onto the aircraft carrier and ends with me flying off it and landing again in Bahrain. So structurally, nothing interesting going on.
I mean, as a reader of the book, an interesting book nonetheless, even if it's not fragmented into pieces I don't recognize as a traditional book. It's this issue of place again. Brixton of the 1980s and The Color of Memory, the place of Los Angeles where we are now, which I've spent a few years trying to understand. Was the aircraft carrier, the U.S.S. George H.W. Bush, a place to understand in the same way that for you any place has been a place to understand?
Oh, that's a good question. I think I wasn't there long enough to arrive at that kind of conclusion. So it's much more just a kind of relaying of my, how I was feeling, what I was thinking, and what I was seeing, almost on a day-to-day basis. I think to do what you're suggesting would have required longer than I had, and a deeper immersion in the experience.
It's like you say, when traveling, you need a few months so you can not be traveling some of those days. So some of the days are just you existing, whereas on the carrier, every day you had to get out there and notice, right?
Yeah, and I've said this before somewhere. I really hate having to notice stuff. I just love being oblivious to the world. So I was doing a lot of noticing, but it wasn't just the kind of noticing that I do like to do, which is noticing funny little things. I felt that really, there was much more straight down the line reporting that needed to be done, and I realized quite early on that I really don't like to report, and I'm barely able to report. And so, in a way, I can imagine that people would go to if somebody was reading this book not because it was by me, but because they go into a bookstore and say, I like books about naval ships.
Yes, you picture the guy. I think you said, did you say at some point a man gets to an age all he reads is military history? He's one of those guys.
That's right. And, you might think, I like aircraft carriers and military jets. I'll read this. And I can imagine for that kind of reader, it would just be an incredible, not just a disappointment, but a really irritating disappointment because of all this me waffling on about myself. But
because you don't remember always someone's rank or things like that?
Those would be quite minor inadequacies. I think they might just find it just the presence of the authorial personality kind of intrusive and irritating.
I just wanted to hear about the ship. He keeps saying I.
Yeah, that's it. And, but I sort of felt that, something useful was coming out of this sort of collision between my sensibility and the place.
So when you're sitting there among the higher officers, the captain and such, they're smoking cigars, you're there in the dark amid their smoke, was there ever a moment you were thinking, well, if the cards had lay in a different direction, maybe I, too, would be a ship's captain? Or did it seem like a divide that was unbridgeable at some point?
Oh, yeah, there's no way I could have got into that kind of life. But, one of the things is that, I really liked so many other people, and I enjoyed their company. And, I've been to a number of dinners here in Los Angeles where I've been so bored. Partly because if nobody's making jokes, if there's no wit, then I get bored very quickly. I mean, and people were very funny on the air. There was a lot of bantering, as I think there has to be in this kind of closed environment. So it was consistently so I related to these people, even though their lives were so entirely different to mine. And also, I admired them wholeheartedly.
It doesn't take long to come to the point where you're tearing up along with them, right? When they are.
Well, they weren't tearing up.
They would be if they could allow themselves that. Maybe inside they were doing some equivalent.
I think none of them were tearing up. I think it was just this sort of sentimental kind of thing. It doesn't take much to make me tear up. And yeah, I mean, there was just some incredible. There were just some really great moments of my life took place in the little time I was on the beach. And actually, so I'm pretty confident they weren't tearing up. But in a way, I mean, part of my job description was to be in a state, just to be there and to be capable of tearing up, or at least being capable of responding adequately to things, some of which were really incredibly moving.
And as well, you can entertain certain thoughts that I would think an officer on that ship doesn't allow themselves to. Like, you're on a helicopter that just circles for 3 hours at a time. You're thinking, what if all this is accomplishing nothing? What if this is not worth it? There's billions of dollars of effort. And it's like you're in a Graham Greene novel at a certain point. What if this Cold War is just nothing, right?
Yeah, it's one of the things I've always done, really. I've always felt very sort of confident about giving free rein to the sort of vagaries of my own nature and the peculiarities of my own take on things. So, and I think in a way, that's where the interest of the book lies, actually, in the fact that this is a peculiar sensibility as opposed to just a diligent kind of reporter. Now, I really want to make clear I'm not at all knocking diligent reportage. On the contrary, I mean, I'm sort of on record as saying it's the kind of writing I most enjoy at the moment. But, the thing is, it was me on the aircraft carrier, and so I might as well bring to that job the things that I'm good at, as opposed to trying to pass myself off as somebody else, So I ended up doing what, in a sense, I'd been commissioned to do, which was to diarise the experience.
For whatever way, yes. It's. I want to know, will we ever see a diarised view of Los Angeles? I want to know what questions this place is putting into your head.
Oh yeah, I don't know, but I'm certainly always at the mercy of my own experience. So I've got no plans to write a book about LA, but I'm here, and yeah.
I've been speaking here with Geoff Dyer, the author of many books, fiction, non-fiction, and the stuff in between. His new one is Another Great Day at Sea, Life Aboard the U.S.S. George H.W. Bush, and he's got the reissues from Grey Wolf Press right now of two early novels, The Color of Memory and The Search. Geoff, thanks so much.
Oh, thank you, Colin. Great pleasure.
This has been Notebook on Cities and Culture. I've been Colin Marshall. Keep up with all the cultural creators, internationalists, and observers of the urban scene on the show at colinmarshall.org. Thanks. A special thanks to everyone who backed Season 4 on Kickstarter, including Joel Neville Anderson, Daniel Levin Becker, Paige Calvert, Commander Manvark, Jonathan Crow, John Cunningham, David Dawes, James DeVito, Tim Dobbs, Paul Doyle, Jake Elliott, Kevin Emmett, Lawrence English, Jonathan Filbert, Andrew Philippone Jr., Michael Fransky, John French, Themistocles Eucrucius, Will Graham, Umberto Grant, Samuel Hansen, David Hayes, Jeff Hillenbrand, Mark Hines, Andrew Johnstone, Tadeusz Andrzej Kadlubowski, Peter Kavanagh, Ted Kane, Andy Cooney, Evan Landman, Alfred Lee, James Maloney, Sean McDonald, Alberto Bruzos Moro, Jason Miller, Rob Montz, Daniel Murphy, Richard Nash, Aidan Nullman, Patrick O'Flaherty, Danny Olson, Michael O'Regan, Ian Blosker, Christopher Porter, MJ Pritchett, Piers Rippey, Rob Schultz, Todd Shimoda, Cam Smith, Deborah Smith, Adam Sutherland, Maureen Kincaid Speller, Anna Treher, Thomas Unterberger, Matt Warren, Nick Weigelt, Dion Wolfe, Cynthia Yang, and Wayne Wright.